What is going on with the UK, the European, and the US car industries right now? It feels almost, you might say, like Carmageddon. A lot of people are talking about things like Brexit, political interventions, or even trade wars. But actually, there's something much bigger going on here. So, let's take a deep dive into the data and explore how we got here and why this is happening. Let's start with the big picture. This chart shows the biggest car producers and exporters around the world. You've got Japan, Germany, South Korea, and the US, countries that have dominated the global car market for decades. But in recent years, there's been a seismic shift. The transition from internal combustion engine cars to electric vehicles has completely changed the game. And the biggest beneficiary of this shift? China. Just look at how it has leapfrogged everyone else in terms of the number of cars it's exporting around the world. So, what's going on here? How has China managed to dominate this market so quickly? But before we dive in, make sure that you subscribe to the Borderline Wisdom channel, and if you've not already, hit that notification bell so that you never miss one of our episodes. Well, so part of the story is that it's simply much cheaper to make electric cars in China right now. Let me show you an example. Here's the cost breakdown for making a Volkswagen ID.3 in Europe, a car that's comparable to certain Chinese models. Now compare that to the cost of making a BYD Seal, a similar car, in China. It's 29% cheaper to make the Chinese car. And it's not just the battery that's cheaper, although that's a big part of it. Every single component, from the chassis to the electronics, costs less to produce in China. Why is it cheaper? Well, there are a few reasons. First, expertise. China has invested heavily in building up its EV manufacturing capabilities over the past decade. Second, state aid. Chinese car makers benefit from massive government subsidies, both visible and invisible. In fact, across the sector, Chinese subsidies are up to 9 times higher than what you'd find in the OECD, which includes most developed countries. Yes, the UK and EU also provide subsidies to their car makers, but the scale in China is on a completely different level. And it doesn't stop there. China also has tariffs in place to protect its domestic market, while power costs in Europe are significantly higher than in China. In fact, industrial power costs are the highest in the UK compared to anywhere else in the developed world. If you're a car maker deciding where to build your factory, that's a huge factor. In China, much of the power comes from coal, which is cheaper, though of course not as environmentally friendly. But there's another layer to this story, and it's about the changing industrial architecture of car manufacturing. Historically, the engine was the most complex and expensive part of a car to produce. It required a lot of skill, precision, and expertise. And this is where China struggled in the past. They couldn't compete with the likes of Germany or Japan when it came to building high-quality engines. But with electric vehicles, the game has changed. The engine is no longer the centerpiece. Instead, it's the battery that dominates the cost structure. Batteries now account for 39%, by far the largest share, of the total cost of an EV. And making batteries is a completely different skill set. You can't just take the expertise and jobs from engine manufacturing and transfer them to battery production. This shift has created a real conundrum for car makers in Europe and the US. Now, let's talk about how China has come to dominate the battery market. Right now, 65% of the global EV market is Chinese. But when you look deeper into the supply chain, the numbers are even more striking. China produces 82% of the world's EV batteries. And when you break it down further, looking at the components that go into those batteries, like anodes and cathodes, China's dominance is even greater. For example, 87% of anodes and 96% of cathode are made in China. Even if you're making batteries outside of China, you're still relying on Chinese components. And it doesn't stop there. The chemicals used in batteries, largely made in China as well. The only area where China doesn't dominate is mining, because you can't control where lithium or cobalt is found. That's a geological issue. But what about Europe? Is its car industry in crisis? Well, it depends on who you ask. The automotive sector is a cornerstone of Europe's economy, accounting for 7% of EU GDP. But carmakers are struggling to adapt to the production of battery electric vehicles, a transition that Brussels is betting on as it prepares to phase out combustion engine cars by 2035. Between 2019 and 2022, car production in Europe slumped, and while it bounced back marginally in 2023, the number of newly registered cars is still lower than it was pre-pandemic. Even more concerning, the share of battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles in European car makers' output has declined in recent months. In August, registrations of electric cars dropped by 43.9% compared to the same month in 2023. Germany, the bloc's industrial powerhouse, saw an astonishing 68.8% decline. This is happening at the same time as cheap, China-made EVs are flooding the European market, driving down prices. The EU is set to impose tariffs on these imports starting October 31st, lasting for at least 5 years, in an effort to restore fair competition. Additionally, new carbon emission standards kicking in next year will lower the legal limit for CO2 emissions to 94 grams per kilometer and introduce annual targets for vehicle emissions. Brussels hopes these measures will incentivize the production and sale of zero and low-emission vehicles. However, not everyone is optimistic. Europe's leading carmaker association, ACEA, is calling for a 2-year delay in the new CO2 regulations, fearing they could further stifle the competitiveness of Europe's EV sector. Meanwhile, China's domestic car industry continues to grow at an astonishing pace. In 2023, China registered 16.1 million new battery electric vehicles, compared to Europe's 6.7 million. Its increasing share of the global market shows no signs of slowing down. So, how has all of this impacted the global car industry? Governments around the world are starting to take action. The US and Canada have imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. India has high tariffs as well. Turkey and the EU have recently introduced tariffs too. But there's one major outlier, the UK. Right now, the UK still has 0% tariffs on Chinese EVs, making it one of the most attractive markets in the world for Chinese carmakers. And with the UK's 2035 EV mandate looming, this raises a critical question. What will this mean for the future of the UK car industry?